Welcome to page 9 of the NEFAR Suggested Form of Purchase and Sale Agreement. At the top of that page in paragraph 15, we talk about the rare instance where there was a damage to the property after the contract was signed but before the closing. Basically, that burden should fall on the seller, and we say so here. I want you to read that paragraph in the entirety, but I'll summarize it. If the damage is less than 3% of the price, then the seller has to fix it. If it's more than 3% of the price, the buyer could cancel or say, I want you to fix it, I don't want to cancel. Then the seller has a choice to say, I'll fix it or I won't. And if the seller won't, the buyer gets the binder back. But again, read that on your own. Thank God it's not a common occurrence. We're to an important paragraph next, 16, personal property. There are a few changes here from the prior version. We begin with line 443. That line hasn't changed. It says the following items, if owned by seller and existing on the property on the date of this contract, then they convey. That is, they stay with the property. And so you'll read those, and it says things like the range, the oven, the cooktop, dishwasher, disposal, ceiling fan. One thing we took out was intercom. That's not very common anymore. It's trash compactor is new, and it says audio visual. And then we added smart outlets as staying, and we added thermostats, and we added keyless entry devices. Those are new. Also notice, not new, but it says on the next line, all window treatments. That means blinds, that means drapes, that means verticals. Everything that's a window treatment is obligated to stay, unless you accept it in the following lines that we'll talk about in a minute. Then we have the check boxes. The check boxes are things that don't have to stay, but if the buyer checks them and the seller signs, then they will stay. And there's some common items: refrigerators, washer, dryer, gas logs. We added security cameras. That's new in this version. And we added other smart home devices must specify. The committee considered this for a long time, for hours. How do we want to word this? And we gathered samples from all over the country. And we decided, and the board agreed, that the best thing was to keep it simple. Whatever those smart devices are, list them. And then you'll read all of the other things. Some are common, some are not, like wine cooler may not be that common. And we have all those. And then there's a line for other. People say, well, what would other be? Could be a flat screen TV, could be a pool cover, could be a swing set, propane gas. Because remember, propane gas is personal property. And if you don't list it as personal property, then in theory, the seller could take it with them. Sellers used to be able to call a gas company and they would pump it back and they'd get some money, but I think that's not very common anymore. But it would be safe to list the propane gas for those few properties that have that. We've always had the lines for items specifically excluded. I noticed that the FAR contract has adopted this phrase and a lot of our other phrases, and we use some of theirs, and now they have a similar phrase. So what would you exclude? Well, how about rose bush by front door? Because it says plants in the ground stay. Maybe the seller husband grows prize rose bushes and wants to transplant that. So you would list rose bush by front door. Maybe you would put drapes and valance in child's bedroom. Maybe they want to take that with them and the buyer agrees. Perhaps you would say a chandelier. Maybe it's a family heirloom. That's what those lines are for. Then in paragraph 17, we have 3 new lines that weren't there before. The new lines say, if marked, the following are attached hereto and made a part of this agreement. And this agreement will not be deemed accepted unless and until all marked addenda, riders, and disclosures have been signed/initialed as appropriate by both buyer and seller and delivered to buyer and seller or their respective broker. So if you check one of these off, you've got to make sure that you include that and get it signed, or you're not under contract. So this clarifies it. Those are important new words in 463 to 465. And then we list some, but by no means all, of the addenda, but we want to jog your memory as to what you might want to include. If it's a condominium, obviously we need the condominium rider. If there's an HOA with mandatory dues, we need that addendum. If it's in a CDD, we want that because it needs to be signed. If it was built before 1978, we need the lead-based paint addendum. Continued marketing addendum is one that no buyer would mark. That would be a counteroffer. Here's the example. The buyer checked off at the top of page 2 that it was contingent on them selling another property. The seller could reject that offer or accept it or go with the middle ground by counteroffering by marking continued marketing addendum, filling out the continued marketing addendum, and present it to the buyer for signature. In that addendum, it says, all right, we're under contract, but I, the seller, have the right to continue to market my property. And if I find a buyer who I want to accept, then I give you a certain amount of time, 24 hours, to take your contingency of selling your house out and make the binder hard. And we could put in there that you have to pay more binder. So again, we don't expect any buyer to check off continued marketing addendum, but a seller might do that as a way of a counteroffer. If you have oceanfront property, not riverfront, but oceanfront, you're going to check the coastal construction line disclosure addendum. It talks about two things. There are certain sea turtle protection laws, and also you may not be able to rebuild if your property is damaged by fire or storm, if it's grandfathered in but seaward of this coastal construction line. Short sale addendum, if your transaction is a short sale, you'll need to mark that one. For your protection, get a home inspection, and we tell you that's for FHA financing. So only for, but every time there's FHA financing, you would mark that, make that part of the transaction, have everybody sign it. And then no buyer is going to mark counteroffer addendum, but if the seller wants a counter, many sellers like to do the counter right on the contract. You'd go to page 1 where it said the price offered was $100,000. You'd mark through it. You'd put 105. You would initial it. You would change the other numbers so they add up to 105. You would date your initialing and you would submit it back, and hopefully the buyer will do the same. Or you could use this form that we offer called the counteroffer addendum that says change line 38 from 100,000 to 105 and change the other lines in a certain manner. And then we tell you there in line 474 and 475 that the buyer and seller have to sign that addendum and this purchase and sale agreement. The reason is this purchase and sale agreement talks about a lot of things that aren't in the counteroffer addendum, so they need to agree to everything. The energy-related one is the PACE one. Only if the properties, one of those approximately 100 properties in Clay County that has the PACE lien, will you need to include that, and then others specify. So years ago, the first checkbox was seller's property disclosure, and we took that out because we don't need lenders to see the seller's property disclosure. That's between the buyer and seller, and we don't want it to be one. Buyers, you want to ask for it, and you want to make sure you get it during the inspection period, but we don't necessarily want it to be part of the contract. However, if it was a cash transaction, you would put that under other seller's property disclosure. You'd want to make that part of the contract. Now we come to the open lines. They continue on page 9, but on page 10, but they start on the bottom of page 9. What would go on those lines? My first caution is to tell you not to play lawyer. Don't rewrite the contract entirely, but there's some few things. My second information is write a complete sentence with a noun and a verb. If you just put one, appraising, that's not a sentence. It doesn't mean anything. You meant to write, if it's a cash transaction, buyer's obligation to perform this agreement is contingent on the property appraising for at least whatever the price is. You fill in the dollar amount. What else would go in there? Something like seller agrees to repaint the master bedroom in a pastel color prior to closing. Don't say buyer requests that seller repaint. That's not contractual, but seller will, seller agrees, seller shall repaint. That would be a sentence with a noun and a verb. So those are the kind of things that you can do that. I'll tell you a couple of unusual ones that I've encountered. I represented a very nice man who's a professional bass fisherman. No, not Glen East. And he said to me, I want you to write in some language because I'm buying 4 acres and a house in Middleburg, and I want to be able to put 3 garages on the property to house my boats. So he said to his realtor, before we make the offer, Jeff Marks is going to tell you what to put in there. So we wrote in there, buyer's obligation to perform this agreement is contingent on there being no public or private restriction or prohibition on the construction, placement, or erection of 3 garages on the property. Luckily, it was only an 8-lot subdivision. All of them were big lots, about 4 acres. When I read the covenants restrictions, they were vague. I couldn't tell Peter, this was his name, whether or not he could put 4 garages. But because it was only 8-lot subdivision, we were able to convince the 8 people to let us rewrite it to make it clear that you could do that. That wouldn't go well in a larger subdivision. The strangest thing I've ever seen in this paragraph was the following. Buyer's obligation to close is contingent on the buyer husband being alive and well and employed at his present job full-time at the time of closing. Guess what his job was? Before I tell you, the wife had an income that would have supported the mortgage loan, but she didn't want that big house if he wasn't alive and well and employed full-time at his present job. Very unusual. He was a member of the SWAT team. That concludes page 9.